Regen Ledger is the backbone of ecological accounting system. We were pioneers in bringing the term and concept of regeneration and regenerative into essentially the mainstream. We worked with both small cutting edge companies, and we also worked with like megacorps. Our job really is to set up the tools and then to connect with entrepreneurs. How many billions of dollars currently could be remitted? What's the carbon outcome that could be had? What's a plausible way to monitor that? Who can become...
Welcome to the Bare Metal Podcast.
Hi everyone, this is Ship the Code from Rockaway X. Today I've got here with me on the Bare Metal Podcast, Gregory, Landua from the Regen Network project. Hey, welcome Gregory.
Martin, awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's get us started right into the weeds. What is Regen Network, the blockchain? What's its purpose?
Yeah, so the blockchain itself, which we refer to as Regen Ledger, is the backbone of a ecological accounting system. And so it's the distributed database where we're storing data about claims and allowing particular execution logic to trigger minting events for what we call eco credits. And eco credits could be thought of as sort of like the primary unit of account or the primary units of account, because there's many types of eco credits for the regenerative finance industry. And so this is basically the minting toolkit for people to create units, digital units of account that represent carbon sequestration, biodiversity, water quality, and potentially other indicators of ecological health that are found to be valuable. And we can go into why they're valuable and, sort of other dimensions of that. But that's the basic sort of overview of the functionality and the purpose of Regen Ledger. And then Regen Network really could be conceptualized as the community of organizations and individuals who use Regen Ledger and are working on this broader regenerative finance movement together.
I think that's, I'm looking forward to dig into all of these things. I think that's great as an intro. I'd be first interested in how you guys got to the solution, right? So oftentimes, people in crypto could ask, hey, why are you using a ledger? Why is a ledger needed? I'm interested in how you guys got to this point, to where you guys married sort of regenerative finance with blockchain tech, because there's got to be an interesting origin story there, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, so, interesting for me, I guess. I lived it. Let the listeners and viewers be the judge of how interesting it actually is. So my background before founding Regen Network, I've been a serial founder and entrepreneur, always focused on regenerative economics, regenerative finance, and specifically very practical regenerative agriculture and land use processes. And so before founding Regen Network, I owned and operated a business called Genesis International, which is still a thriving consultancy and does amazing work with corporations around the world on their systems of supply, or what people normally refer to as supply chains. And a big part of what we were doing was intervening and shifting, both the paradigm and the practices on the ground from sort of degenerative, extractive supply chain, optimized for efficiency at the expense of ecological health and social health, and shift that to a little bit more complex web of production relationships where you're optimizing for ecological health, social health, and biodiversity in the cropping systems and business models.
So I'm interested in more, but I'd love to quickly ask here, what was the uptake on this? Do you feel like, the subjects you were talking to, the companies, are they coming around to, feeling like, ever. Yeah, we should be more than ever. So you're
look,
optimistic.
We were pioneers in bringing the term and concept of regeneration and regenerative into essentially the mainstream. And if you look now, and we worked with both small cutting edge companies, which would be considered sort of like the flagship, beyond organic, groovy, fair trade, organic companies, mostly in North America, but globally as well. And we also worked with like megacorps and continue to do that work. If you look now, Syngenta, Bayer, General Mills, Unilever, Barry Callebaut, all of the biggest companies in the world are talking about regenerative agriculture. And now, whether or not that's greenwashing and a banalization of a concept or sort of like a success at transforming the industry, we need 20 years to know. And that's the game.
If they're serious about this.
That's the game. I mean, look, people are, I think, genuinely people within those organizations are serious. Stakeholders are serious. It's also an uphill battle. And so this 100%. Gets us into the blockchain, right? Because we have an economy, a political economy, and sort of just the money economy, the way finance works, the way economics works, that tends to subsidize and incentivize extraction and degradation of ecosystems, right, in order to generate financial profit.
Because that's the only value that's counted, right?
Because that's the only
value. It has to be converted to
counted.
money, right?
Right. But you have these signals that people like, there's ESG, which is environment, social, and governance metrics. You have CSR, which is corporate social responsibility. You have regenerative economics, which goes far beyond either of those. You have the SDGs, right? The Sustainable Development Goals. You have all these acronyms and words. Okay, those are signals those are like coded signals of people expressing interest and preference to change things, right?
Hopefully some intent, right? Yeah.
With some intent, there's like a mix of intent, but let's just say it's 80% positive intentions and maybe 20% people,
virtue signaling, essentially.
Virtue signaling or having ulterior motives that this just is helpful for them in the moment, but they don't really have any deeper commitment to it. But still, my judgment is it's predominantly good intentioned, right? But it's incredibly hard, right? So we're talking about a shift of what we account, what profit means, right? How agriculture is done, how land use is done, how our material economy works. This is not just like, as long as everybody, and this is, so back when I was working on regenerative agriculture supply, I had this experience over and over again in which I could 100% tell that the humans involved, from the farmers to the logistics people, to the brands, to the customers in a sequence, all had good intentions. I could say that there was nobody who was just like, in a plot, a Machiavellian plot to just virtue signal. However, a lot of times it failed. More often than not, it failed. Why? So I just was asking my question, why is it so hard? It's like a Sisyphean task. We're pushing this boulder up this hill and it keeps coming back down. And the conclusion that I drew was we don't have a common public digital infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily have to be digital. If we could trust institutions and had sort of like information sharing, you could potentially envision a world in which this wasn't digital, but we live in a digital world, right? So we need a reporting system that all stakeholders co-own and cooperate in order to anchor the information that's important to all of them. What in different cultures is referred to the commonwealth, right? Or the commons. There's specific things that if they break down, it actually undermines everybody in the supply, but it does so slowly. And so the games that people play, even if they have good intentions, you have a quarterly cash flow pinch, you have a drought, you have any stress in the system that comes into the system, and people are forced by the way that the data flows and the agreements are made to basically sacrifice the good of the commons for their own personal interests. And it's like that's encoded into the system. That's the way the system works. That's the way the data flows. That's the way fiduciary responsibility is defined. And so that deeper system, right, that deeper system of institutions, system of agreements, system of data flow, system of incentives, that's what has to change. If it's not just going to be virtue signaling and sort of hand waving, right? There has to be a deeper look at the system of incentives. And right, so blockchain, as I think Ethan Buckman of one of the founders of Cosmos has said before, blockchain is essentially social computing. Blockchain allows a network of computers to generate consensus about a set of rules that they're all following, whether those are rules about, how many tokens can be minted and at what rate, right? Or more complex rules, right? About, object or administrative capabilities within a network, or algorithmic rules for minting a carbon credit, or you can set rules. The more complex the rules, right? The more complex the rules, the harder it is, of course. But this is like the first time blockchain is, and this is the why blockchain from my perspective. Blockchain is the first time that we have this leap from this institutional leap, this capability of humans to organize and coordinate leap from I've got a personal computer, which I own, right? Or a company has a set of personal computers that they own, and maybe they have a server and they have an agreement with an administrator. But at the end of the day, that person could get hired or fired, and they have complete network control, right? As the sysadmin.
Right.
So the partners, to something in which there's like a digital constitution, which transparently says what the rules are and the processes to upgrade those rules in the network. And what that does is it allows us, and this is where everybody gets hand wavy, and it's like trustlessness, right? I don't really think it creates a fully trustless environment. I think that's kind of a misnomer, but it lowers the amount that you need to trust any individual and their specific intentions, because you have essentially a digital constitution and you can tell the programmatic logic, the digital constitution, who's capable of doing what, where the data is, what the rules are. And my analysis is that's what's needed in, this sort of system of functions that is our global economy. We need that, right, at a large level to be able to shift our accounting system to account for the health of living systems, or what I would refer to as living capital, has to be included into that. The positives and the negatives, and the rules, and that's a social. I'll sort of back up and get out of my geeky jargon talk, but there's a system. So the rules for accounting for living capital, at the end of the day, are going to be social rules about how we practice science. This is like the scientific method. This is the institutionalization of the scientific method for Earth observation in order to make claims, right? In the best possible way, so that you can tell where the data is coming from, what the analysis algorithm is,
right?
How it was processed. And you can create a network of replicable claims so that they can be replicated. That's the basis of science. If you run an experiment, you want other scientists to be able to replicate it, right? And if you can if you can make a prediction and other people can replicate the prediction and it's successful, that's what's considered a theory that is sort of becomes a bedrock of our material science, our economy. Like those are the foundations of like how humans make meaning, right? We have to apply that same kind of paradigm of approach, and like, look, last thing I'll say is that's a really, I don't know how aware people are, but that's a radical difference from how the institutions of trust and accountability currently work in our economy. So currently, replicability, auditability are not the primary driver.
Our second fiddle, 100%.
And the first fiddle is just like
ownership.
An institutional trust model in which an institution has centralized. It's like, oh, just trust the CDC or just trust the organic certification industry. They have it all covered, right? Instead of like, oh, federated open learning system in which you can tell certainty and uncertainty about claims, right? Which I believe that leap for humans, we have to make that leap now. I mean, this is not even just I happen to be passionate about land use and agriculture, right? I happen to be, and ecological degradation broadly, of which climate change is the most sort of like,
I guess,
fixated. People fixated on a lot, but there's deeper problems going on. That's my passion. That's what I work in. But this same set of patterns, and institutional distrust and inability to know what the hell is going on, happens at every level of society, right? And so this shift, this is the interesting, to me, this is the interesting research and development and entrepreneurial opportunity of our generation, whether it's AI or climate change, or we call it blockchain. There's this paradigm shift of how we participate in knowing what the hell is going on and what to do about it.
That was a really impressive explanation of why you guys went this way. So like the major function of the Regen Ledger I'm hearing is a open co-owned data clearinghouse, right? Open to everybody, inspectable, where it's the replicability and the inspectability is first, and then ownership is second, right? So that's where everybody sort of gets together. You also mentioned a few times, algorithmics, minting. I noticed, if I'm not wrong, Regen Network doesn't support smart contracts. So you guys
not currently.
You guys implement your logic in Cosmos modules, right?
Yeah.
So
I think there is some conversation about implementing CosmWasm. It would probably be similar to Stargaze,
right,
where it would be a permission CosmWasm. So would just give developers a couple of choices, but I think we'll continue. I mean, this is up to the community at this point. There are cases to having an arbitrary smart contracting system. There's also reasons not to.
Sure. And I'm perhaps more interested in sort of can you give me an example of what sort of algorithm might be captured, whether it's smart contract or in the Cosmos SDK layer? It's a matter of implementation.
Yeah.
What are the things? So you know the emission schedules, right? Or when tokens can be emitted. Could you take us through like one example? Like I'm very naively thinking about this. Okay, let's say I plant 50 trees somewhere in a forest, and then somebody has to, I guess, come and observe that, measure that. Hey, are those trees actually there? How do I track this through time? What are the expected let's say carbon sequestration properties of these trees, and then how can I? And somewhere on the chain, magic happens in between right now for me. And then somewhere on the chain, a certificate or a token is emitted, which somebody can buy, and interest parties can buy and offset their, either use it as an offset or become neutral or, just generally help out. So could you take me through an example of like maybe something else than planting trees? I don't know. You're the expert here, but, can you take me through an example of how this would work and where the discussion happens, where the key points are in the system between those emissions and the original, let's say, effect in nature?
Sure. And so I'll tell you how it's working now currently. Mm-hmm. And I think I'll also walk through an example of how it will work in the future as we increasingly automate processes, right? Mm-hmm. So right now we have a pretty naive and unautomated system, right? So step one is, and this is about to change. There's governance processes that are underway, but step one at this moment, in order to get a credit onto Regen Ledger, step one is you need to go through a process with all the token holders have voted on a registry program guide and sort of an oversight group. And that group has the responsibility to make sure if a credit class, which is kind of the bundle of agreements about how a credit is measured, monitored, verified, and minted. That needs to be sort of like reviewed and formalized before that credit class goes on chain, right? And then that credit class has all of the associated metadata and sort of like, how is this credit going to be emitted? And there can be
so it
many
needs
of
a lot of
those.
assistance now, right? So I'm thinking of this. It's like a governance proposal. I have to come and register with the chain, and for the registration, there is a standard sort of document that I have to fill out, which I'm not going to be able to do if I'm an agro guy, right? So somebody has to they need to be somehow connected to the community and say, hey guys, we have a project here. Does this make sense? And could someone help us sort of like prep this thing?
Yeah.
So you write this whole thing up, and I assume there's a template somewhere. I haven't seen that, so that's got to be public, where they fill some things out. And then they provide it to this committee. And so is there a governance vote first?
There's two levels. So one is to register a credit class, which is like this meta registration process. Right. The other is to mint the credits under that credit class. Right. Essentially, both of those have, at this moment, scientific review processes where there are humans who are engaged with checking in the same way that like the legacy carbon registries work, essentially, right? However, like this is where it gets interesting. Like fast forward, and you wanted me to ground it into an example. So, for instance, we have this credit class called Carbon Plus Grasslands. Carbon Plus Grasslands. We use the Carbon Plus Grasslands methodology in its first test to sell the world's largest sale of soil carbon to Microsoft back in 2021. We fused remote sensing data, machine learning, and on-the-ground soil samples to correlate practices, in this case, management-intensive grazing, where cattle are moving across a landscape very quickly in large groups, right? Which mimics herd behavior in, bison or whatever the large ungulates would have been in a savanna, right? Which creates this really interesting pattern of disturbance and regeneration at the end of the day, which results in building soil, right? That's measurable and can be measured against other, the operations emissions of people running around in trucks or moving the cattle and taking them to market, and the, etheric methane emissions of the cat, all of that gets bundled into a model, and there's an equation, and it's like, oh, you're sequestering more carbon than is being emitted because you're following this land use practice. And so there's a scientific methodology that measures that. The data and the method are public and put on chain, and then it can be emitted when as a land steward, you sort of, and really the only thing that the land steward, in that specific methodology, the land steward has fairly low reporting overhead, right?
Which is another key ingredient.
Because a lot of the heavy lifting is happening with satellite data, right? There are other methodologies that have really heavy reporting, and so there's a variety. What we're trying to be opinionated about, right, as a community is, does your data and your methodology match your claim?
Sure.
Whatever the claim is.
I'm trying to summarize this in my head, right? So like a credit class equals sort of like a single type of methodology that has to be developed for this class, and then this class can be applied more widely across different projects. Do I get this right?
Yeah, exactly. Although a credit class could, in different ecosystem types, let's say there's land use, broadly we have grazing. You could have a different methodology in Australia than in the United States if the soil type and
if the environment,
the biogeophysical environment means that you need to have a different approach to measurement. You could swap out a more accurate methodology, which is actually something that's unique. That modular, we've been trying to create a modular system that doesn't exist. That specific ability doesn't exist in existing claims and registration systems, right? They always, it's like whatever the crediting standard is, there's a methodology, you use that methodology and that's it, right?
Doesn't matter if it's Antarctica or the savannah. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. One other question I had, are you guys using commercial satellites, or sort of can you get by with NASA satellite data, which you can get for free, or do you guys commission, I don't know, Planet Labs? How does that work?
Yes. So we use European Space Agency data. We use Landsat data, which is NASA satellites publicly available, and we use planet data. And we're building data integration. So one of the big things we're working on right now is just partnerships, API integrations, and like the data story, so that an analyst who wants to be supporting claim and minting process, usually those are businesses, can just like plug in and essentially run analysis in a replicable container that they can give permissions to replicate those analysis to the appropriate people, do zero knowledge hashing. In some cases, it's important to be able to make data public. And in other cases, you can't. Like if you're running an analysis on planet data, for instance, like that planet data, you have a license as an analyst, but you can't share it. We're actually working with Planet right now on cool licensing extensions for verification, because this is something that doesn't currently happen. Like Planet Labs, amazing company. They're amazing data.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sats.
But so they have real-time, daily refresh, global images
at 30 centimeters.
4 meter pixels, right?
4 meter,
and that's getting
much more detailed.
Well, now but that's like the fleet that has daily refresh that you can plug into. They're getting, it's like 30 centimeter per pixel and they have all sorts of stuff. I actually got to tour their little manufacturing facility and stuff. I'm envious now. That's awesome. In a couple working groups with the founders and team members there. And it's just super impressive. They're amazing for folks who want to geek out. They have great data tools. But one of the challenges that they have in feeding a market for verification services is licensing. So we've been working a bit on both envisioning a licensing future and kind of like feeding to them. Like ultimately that's their decision about how they run a business model and, how they monetize things. But I think there's excitement, right, about what a nice licensing regime is for sort of like public verification purposes, right? Yeah. But also, we can use zero knowledge technology.
Sure, right? To commit to specific satellite data.
Exactly. So you can tell that an on-chain entity has reviewed it and has given a positive result. And so, you get this attestation graph essentially around any specific claim of who has checked it and said that, that it passes the stated requirements for certainty and uncertainty and, rigor according to whatever the standard is.
Yeah, that's super interested in that. That'd be great to be able to use sort of higher tech, like, all the sats that are orbiting now. Basically what Planet Labs has is a scanner, right? So they're just like, the sun synchronous sats are just like sort of looking at scanning individual lines of the planet. It's absolutely amazing. Like you guys can watch it online. I think they have videos on YouTube on how exactly that works.
Yeah,
it's super, super impressive. I'm stoked to hear that you guys are using it. How far do you think we're away from, these sort of, let's say, more automated methodologies, coming online and being able... So actually, one step back, we haven't talked about what the land steward then has to do for reporting, right? So one thing we said, talking about the credit class, that entails a specific scientific methodology, which includes reporting sort of requirements to mint credits, right?
Yeah.
So then, if the second scalable block sort of bottleneck I'm expecting there is that, how do individual stewards report those changes, and how does the the ledger and the network make sure that those claims are accurate before allowing release of those credits, right? Because that's
it depends on the credit class, right? So that logic is entirely expressed and held in the credit class, and that's where you could have a credit class that's built to be progressively automated, right? In which the claims are linked to metrics and measurement that can most easily be collected in an automated fashion. We have been working with a group called Open Team, which for many years, and done some foundational work with them. Again, a lot of this gets to data collection, data licensing, data rights, data availability, data reuse. So Open Team which is USDA, United States Department of Agriculture funded. And we've done a lot of grant work in that process and built a bunch of software that's used in that sort of governmental and like big ag context over the years. The vision there, and this isn't how it currently works. This is where pilots and experiments with different groups are taking place, is to be able to have APIs that allow land stewards, farmers, right, to share at will their data with research organizations, decision-making organizations, and verification and monitoring organizations, right? So a lot of ag, there's a significant amount, there's ever more data collection taking place, right? But the question is, who has the data and who owns it and how can it be used? Kind of similar to the planet question,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
So how do you unlock and bring together these two forms of data? Like if we're thinking of satellite data and we're thinking about field, like in-field data,
moisture, soil moisture.
well, even practices. When did you till? Did you till? When did you plant? How much did you plant? Those are incredibly important for the deeper models about soil health, for instance, and soil carbon.
Right.
As important as the actual samples. I guess what I would say is you also need to be sampling, and that's your like trust anchor, but then you can extrapolate. And the more you have these two data sources coming together and you're sort of able to, infer a huge amount at a high degree of accuracy. So there's a whole world there of people, and there's a validator specifically inside of the Regen Network validator set called Cambium. They work, basically their bread and butter as a dev shop is working on this like farmer data collection and reuse and the integration with the Regen data module, right? And we use RDF and semantic data and signing, anchoring, storage to sort of like integrate with existing tools and APIs so that at choice, a farmer could share either just a signature or a data package that could get reviewed by the appropriate people and be correlative, right? And so you can start to imagine as we develop and formalize these monitoring protocols, what in the white paper we called ecological state protocols, which is basically, a formal overview of the monitoring, reporting, and verification that's needed. You can start to imagine, and we're not quite there yet, but just that formal system can then get automated, right? And significant chunks of it can get automated. So the reporting and the monitoring is both happening in an automated way. So the bulk of that at the moment, as I mentioned earlier,
and constantly confronted together, right? Yeah.
Right. And the bulk of that is happening the old fashioned way, right? Right. With people running that. But all of our engineering effort and all of our product effort is sort of focused on how do we make that easy and transparent and automated so that we can, and why, right? Because then we can drive down the cost of this fairly complex scientific process so that it meets the scale for a smallholder farmer, right? It meets the scale of someone who owns 5 acres or 50 acres or 100 acres somewhere, as well as meeting the scale. Because currently all of this stuff, the cost of all of the people and the engagement and all these things, it really prohibits anyone who has less than like 1,000 or 2,000 acres from entering into a program, right? And that pushes, that sort of like pushes the monetary compensation and the incentives towards a centralization of land ownership, towards a centralization of sort of value extractions. The same people end up making money off of that. And that's been one of our missions, is to try to shift that paradigm and sort of place people who are closer to landscape stewardship and regeneration activities in the driver's seat to be receiving rewards for the work that they're doing to steward those landscapes.
Right. I mean, this sort of scalability vision is tremendously exciting to me. So I'm from Czech Republic. There's so many small forest owners here, who own, a few tens or maybe small hundreds of acres. And essentially, like a lot of people got this through inheritance, and so they have no idea what to do with this. And essentially, the only way they can think in their head of how to use this is to essentially chop down the trees and and sell them or something. So there's no other way for them to engage economically, while preserving these patches. So. And also, it's obviously prohibitive for them to, enter into any of these bigger programs without subsidies. Then you're relying on government. So, getting this scale is a tremendously exciting opportunity, I think, for everyone. And let's dig into this a little bit. So you mentioned the automation. Obviously, automatic error detection, monitoring that can rely on once everything's been tuned, you can use remote sensing to sort of get a good understanding of whether there's something fishy with the data or not. Totally makes sense. Are there any other, for example, legal obstacles? Like you mentioned data licensing several times. That's obviously one that's hard. Anything else, like in terms of jurisdictions or countries? Is the EU more friendly, or how is Asia? Is Australia? Is there something else that's going to impact the scalability here?
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, so there's carbon accounting, especially, is complex and still sort of like in its formation phase. There was the Global Paris Agreement, what people refer to as the Paris Agreement. I guess because that was COP21, maybe, Congress of the Parties, where UN, all the countries get together and they sort of are creating, in some cases treaties, and in other cases just sort of like intentions about how carbon accounting takes place.
Non-binding agreements, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of a mess, right? And different jurisdictions have different approaches. In some jurisdictions, carbon is like a state monopoly. In other jurisdictions, it's completely unregulated. Like the United States, it's like, whatever, do whatever you want. In Europe, it's very formalized, and there's a compliance market, there's a voluntary market. It's much more clear and regulated. So it's complicated. So that's a complexity. That's starting to slowly that's working. That's generally speaking, like jurisdictionally, why you see most of the, you sort of see a certain type of carbon credit in Regen Network and in the market that's kind of like managed the complexity of all of that and found places where there's the right match of legal assurances and data richness to make a claim. Obviously, though, that needs to shift because those aren't necessarily the most important places. And zooming out, I think another big friction point that we have is sort of consensus, standards and consensus about what people normally refer to as additionality, right? So is the claim that's being made and the credit representative of something that is actually supporting decarbonization, right? Is this unit of carbon actually really, as it's stored in the forest or sequestered into the soil, does it really contribute to a net reduction of carbon in the atmosphere? And that, I mean, there's a lot, let's just say there's a lot of scientific fighting about that because there's lots of squabbles and different models. And so it's kind of this ever shifting. So that's a challenge for us as we are trying to scale, you're dealing with this sort of like, it's essentially the politics of the science is the challenge. And we try not to get involved in that because, again, this is one of the reasons why we've taken an open approach where we're saying what we're trying to enforce is that the data and the methodology matches the claim, not that the claim is perfect, right? Because what I'm talking about there is sort of like that the claim is valuable, right? Where if you make this claim about this forest, is it actually the most valuable use of money for decarbonization or not? Right now,
but then that's where the open markets come into play, right? Anybody can choose to buy this or that.
Transparency, exactly. That's where open markets, transparency, and sort of like a healthy competition between standards that allows people to really anchor those claims. So then you're going to get claims that get discounted, right? You're going to get credits that get discounted because they're proven to not be the most effective route to decarbonization. You'll get others that end up trading at a premium because they're more effective for whatever the specific attribute is that they have. And so we're really trying to, again, build that neutral, community-owned accounting and market infrastructure that also allows people, you could see a world in which, sort of the world in which we're aiming for, these big governmental bodies even could program in their standards. You could program in a search, you could program in a standard that people get adhered to, and that becomes sort of like a big preference force in the market.
Right. Yeah, so I'm hoping you guys will figure all this out. I mean, there are a bunch of challenges in front, obviously, but I, for one, am terribly excited to see, how you guys move forward and strike down all these things that are in your path.
Yeah,
so
well, there's a lot of people. This is the beauty, I think, of doing it in a community, sort of an open way, in a decentralized way, is R&D, Regen Network Development Public Benefit Corp, which built and launched Regen Ledger and has done a lot of the sort of data science, heavy lifting, and other things to be trying to create the registry and mature credits. There are a bunch of other actors, right? And so those are the restraints, those are the creative restraints and research challenges and problems that need to be overcome for the system to really thrive and work and provide the value to society that we hope it can. Then the theory of change here is that, like you were mentioning, your in the Czech Republic's context, there are a lot of small land stewards. They could probably be making decent money if they shifted to sort of like an eco-forestry approach. Forests can be massive carbon sinks, especially if they're harvested at a low rate over time, right? They actually increase their carbon sequestration capability. Okay, but there's a set of innovation that needs to take place to unlock that market. So our job really is to set up the tools and then to connect with entrepreneurs who want to tackle specific discrete problems like that, right? Where there's there's a massive market opportunity for, 10 to 20 acre forest holders in Eastern Europe broadly, maybe, right? And you could size that, how many billions of dollars currently could be remitted, what's the carbon outcome that could be had, what's a plausible way to monitor that. And essentially you can become an owner operator of that without having to build the deeper infrastructure, right? And
supplied by you guys.
Have a shared ownership of the bigger market infrastructure, have governance and engagement over that market infrastructure. So that's really who we need to succeed, is driven, intelligent, entrepreneurs who have the capability and the vision to see a specific domain where the deeper infrastructure we've built actually provides more legibility, more fairness, and more efficiency for their specific business based on ecological crediting.
Perfect. Hopefully you guys will find lots of those. I think that's a great place to end the podcast. So thanks very much, Gregory, for coming on the show. It was really exciting to hear what you guys are working on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.